I do adopt a very expansive notion of this life force energy and how we embody it and how we can allow different levels of pleasure in different contexts and at different times. And then one of the things I've based my model on is just like the 8 C words that Dick Schwartz came up with for self energy was I came to the notion that self energy also has sexual qualities and this core self. And I call these the 6 S's of sexual self energy. The idea is that when our system can allow, when our parts can relax, that this core energy we have has qualities of being safe, sensual, spacious, sensitive, steamy, and satisfied.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, you guys. While we know relationships are wonderful, they are also really hard. Many of us believe that they shouldn't be, that if we have good connection and good communication, things will just go smoothly. But it's really that belief that can make us feel stubborn and even more hopeless. So relationships take work. It does for Sue and I. We can make it look easy. It's not. And one of the ways is because many of us, we differ. We differ in what activates us, what makes us feel threat, the expectation, and it's these differences that are held in our body, not our thoughts. And they influence how we talk, how we love, how we fight. So holding that belief, if he or she or they could just understand me, if they love me, they do something different, is not really true. And we're talking about relationships with your partner, your teenager, your mother-in-law. So Sue and I have created an online course that can help you understand yourself and those you love in a different way. This is not just for therapists, it's for everyone. Although the good news is if you're a therapist, you can get CEs along the way, and all of you can use the visuals and the worksheets individually, or you can even use them in your own private practice. So while the course is based on our book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, it is definitely not a replication of the book. We talk directly to you. You learn how to understand more deeply your attachment, those you love, the neuroscience behind it, and how to build secure types of connections right now in your everyday relationships. Rather than changing one another, y'all can shift together in very important ways. It's very powerful. We're getting great reviews. Check it out. It's at therapistuncensored.com/BAS. Therapistuncensored.com/BAS. The BAS stands for Beyond Attachment Styles, the Science of Growing Secure Adult Relationships. And by the way, the cost of the course is about the amount of one individual therapy session, and yet you get hours and hours and hours of what we think is extremely valuable information. So check it out. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Therapist Uncensored. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that I think most of us navigate with at least some discomfort, some of us more than others. It's sexuality. Sexuality with ourselves, sexuality in our relationships. Today, our guest is an expert in helping us all explore sexuality in a way that can help us open up, become more comfortable talking and exploring ourselves, something that is not always easy to do with some of our culture, some of our personal histories, and we'll dive into that. So our guest is Patricia Rich. Patricia is a licensed clinical social worker. She's also a certified sex therapist and supervisor, and she is certified in IFS. Welcome to the show, Patricia.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so happy. I don't know that I've told you this, but one of the reasons that we got excited about having you on the show is that a wonderful Patreon member reached out after attending one of your trainings and said that she loved it and gained so much from it. And with a topic like, okay, I'm in, I totally trust her, love our Patreon members. I'm like, let me check it out. So I checked out your stuff and am very excited about our conversation today.
That's great. I'm excited too.
So you've developed an approach that, as I've gone more deeply into it, I feel really inspired. It's called the self-led sexuality approach. Is that correct?
That is.
And it's an approach that brings internal family systems model into sexuality discussions and therapy. Is that correct?
It is,
Yeah.
yes.
So, I mean, we have had discussions about internal family systems before, but most of our audience may not know what that is. So we don't have to dive right into that right away. Let's just talk about, like, because you're also a sex therapist. And one of the conversations we were having before we started, I thought was so fun because we were talking about it, that we have some difficulty talking about it. So, well, how do you get your clients to feel more comfortable in talking about sexuality? And you said, well, actually, it's more difficult to get therapists to feel more comfortable talking about it than it is clients. I thought that was pretty funny.
I have found that to often be the case. Our clients just read our attitude and our energy. So if we're coming in with a lot of nervousness around it, they're going to pick up on that. And when we come in feeling open and curious and not pushing, respecting their boundaries and what they want to share, but just kind of creating a space where we let them know that is welcome, they're often more than willing to share and talk about things that are actually quite important to people's quality of life and the quality of connection they're feeling in their relationships, maybe how they're feeling about their body. And it is such an integral part of life. There's an aspect of it tied into probably almost any clinical topic you could think of, but we often are not trained as therapists to include that and to have a comfort level bringing that into the conversation.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so hard for us? Why do you think, just as humans in our culture, that it's just like the idea of diving in makes us into the idea of sexuality makes us so uncomfortable?
Well, I like that you brought in the word culture because I think that is the main thing, right? Because when babies are born, they are embodied, they are in their little bodies and not separating what's private, what's public, what's shaming or shameful, what isn't. How do we grow into adults who have all these both appropriate perhaps boundaries and ability to function as a society, and also all these inhibitions and burdens and shame and maybe just very narrow understandings even of what our sexual energy is or what all the different ways, sexuality is just a part of being alive. So a lot of that's culture, how parents, both like the therapists as well, children pick up on the parents' comfort level with their bodies, their own bodies, and with the babies and children's bodies. So it comes through implicitly and it also comes through explicitly in what we're taught, what we aren't taught. And that's, of course, layered with all the other institutions, whether those are religious or government or, which sexual orientations are perhaps welcomed and celebrated and which ones are not, right? So there's just so many layers of culture, relationship, etc.
And we're so often unaware of what that implicit communication is in our body, aren't we? Like, about the idea of what do we think about sexuality, where we feel comfortable with our own sexuality or talking about it. It feels like it's just so unspoken, and we're often not aware of the things that are activating us.
That's true. That's true. And somatic awareness is a big part of what I bring into the self-led sexuality model as well, which is really helping people notice their bodies. Of course, people have different levels of comfort, relationship, trauma histories, etc., that might impact how much embodiment they may be able to experience. But there's a lot of invitations that I offer to people to really feel into the signals their body is giving them, and even to listen to the voices and preferences of different parts of the body. So there's a lot of different levels of attunement that can come in.
So you were a sex therapist for quite a while, is that right? Before you decided that it was really, really important to add the IFS, the parts and the somatic part. Can you tell me about that? What made you shift?
I had a kind of larger trajectory, becoming a social worker first and working with kids and then with the parents and getting interested in relationship work. And then I started to bring in sexuality because I had a comfort level with it, and people were very happy to be able to include that in their relationships. So I kind of did that on my own for a period of time. And then I pursued training in sex therapy, and I learned a ton in my program. And at the same time, I felt like it was sort of lacking some deeper transformation. It was more about behavioral approaches and psychoeducation. And then it felt like there was kind of a missing piece for me. And I had encountered a teeny bit of IFS earlier in my career and re-encountered it after I had been practicing sex therapy by someone who actually was doing both. And I attended an introduction to IFS weekend, which really blew my mind. And it was so transformational for me personally. And then I really wanted to get into the training. And I was lucky that at that time it was not difficult to get into a training, which it is now. It can be quite a while till people can access a spot. But back in the day, that was not the case. And so it just opened up so many different ways to approach the material with people.
Yeah,
And
speak to that. Like how specifically, so you're doing sex therapy and then you felt this openness. What do you feel like IFS? And of course, for those of you that IFS might sound like new information, we're talking about internal family systems. Maybe in a nutshell, what is IFS? And then you could help us understand why that feels so important to consider when you're talking about sexuality and one's body.
IFS is an approach. It was developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz, and he was developing the model based on what he was learning and using the language of the clients that he was working with at the time, not in the realm of sexuality, but working with trauma and eating disorders. So there's a few basic assumptions in the IFS model. One of them is that multiplicity is normal, that we all have what some might call subpersonalities, some would call parts of a person that really are more than just a feeling. There's kind of a consciousness center in a way. I think of it like we have organs in the body. We have one body, but then we have organs that have different jobs and do different parts of helping us be alive. And it's almost like a psychological body that has different parts that have different functions and jobs. And when they're all working together, we don't really notice, right? Just like our body, if we're healthy, we don't really notice that we have a lung and a kidney, right? But if we're not that harmonized, we're not doing that well, we might start to become more aware of our body parts. And psychologically, we might become more aware of our parts if we're having a conflict about something, or maybe having a debate in our mind. And it's like one part of me wants to go on a date with this person, and this other part of me is saying, are you crazy? The last person broke your heart. Don't ever go out with anyone ever again. So there can be parts of us representing different aspects of our, how to navigate in the world. And then we also can have the parts of us that carry more vulnerability, have been wounded, and can potentially have taken on really heavy emotions, beliefs, things we call burdens. And so it's called internal family systems, not because it's our actual family inside, but that there's a relationship. It's a system of parts in us. So when we can actually help these different parts of us all feel respected and to have relationships with each other, we often feel more cohesive and like we're more fully into what we're doing. There's one other element, which is that as people find these parts, there's something underlying them, which is a different kind of sense of self. So we have these parts, but there's like this bigger sense of self that we can feel when our parts sort of soften. And so I was excited to be able to help people when they're having problems in their sexual lives, to not just start with, okay, if you have this problem, here's a prescription, go do these exercises. And more so, oh, what do you feel inside when you talk about having that problem? When you can't get an erection, like what happens for you? What do you feel in or around your body? What are you saying to yourself? And so there's some ways that are flexible, but help take someone right to the immediacy of what's happening in the moment, and then to start to get curious about the different parts of themselves that are already kind of involved in it.
Yeah, you're describing just the IFS model in such an articulate shorthand. I really, really appreciate that, because even if you've been trained in it, I mean, sometimes understanding really what's going on inside is hard to really kind of put a pin on in a way that a light bulb goes on. And I think you just did a really good job. And I think about how often we have these different parts of ourselves in conflict, but we just get pissed. We get mad, like I keep being attracted to the bad guy, right? Or I think about ways that we get mad at ourselves because parts of ourselves is saying one thing but the other part does another. And instead of getting to know, well, there is a part of us that desires this and there's the part of us that is in conflict with it, having room for both sides, having room for that conflict can be so invigorating and can be so freeing, rather than just chastising and pushing forward. Or
Definitely. And another really important piece is this assumption that all of our parts have a positive intention for us. So, we can often really shame certain parts of ourselves, and it can be really hard to recognize what could ever be positive about me cheating on my partner, or, harming myself by using too many drugs and then having sex with people. I mean, like, it could be at any level, or it could just be criticizing myself all the time for the size of my, body or something like that. So it can be hard to appreciate that even the parts of ourselves that do those things may have a very positive intention for our survival, even though the impact is very harmful to ourselves or others.
so take those. I mean, you gave 3 great examples. Take those examples, thinking about having an affair on my partner or the parts of us that are criticized. Take a few of those examples and help us understand how those aspects of ourselves also have positive natures to them, at least the development of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I would help someone to first notice, like what happens inside of you when you're about to call, that person that you're attracted to and you're not supposed to be talking to anymore. Some of it's the body sensation. It might just be this urge. Maybe it's like, my hand has a life of its own. Like, I don't even know I'm doing it. And I've already sent 3 text messages, and
I think everyone can relate to that one out there. Like, my head's saying don't do it, but I'm just clicking away, or I'm dialing the phone. And yes.
Yeah. And then, maybe they're saying, God, I can't believe I did that, so we just might slow down. That's a big thing. Just like, let's take a slow down, like just take a minute and let's just be with all of that. Right. So part of you is saying, I can't believe you did that. Where do you sense that one in or around your body? It's over here on my right side. And it's telling me, are you crazy? Like, you just did how many hours of therapy? How much money did you just pay your couples therapist? And you still want to reach out to this person? You don't even like them anymore. Like, what are you doing? Right. So then you can welcome that part,
Give
and
it
then
room rather than shame it.
room.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, I'm glad you're here. So this is still the one who's worried about it. Right. So we want to pay attention to both. Like, what are you worried about? And then turning to the other one, hey, so you're saying you're texting, you don't even know you're doing it. Can we just take a breath? Maybe just notice that. What do you feel in or around your body when you kind of had that impulse to text? What went through your mind? And first finding the impulse, sort of finding the energy center behind that behavior, right? And then getting curious with it. Like, okay, like, I am in a space right now. We check for that. Okay, I am feeling some room here just to be curious and learn more about you too. Like, what's going on? And then this part might just be like, you're bored. You're so bored. Maybe I have a boring job. And I'm like, okay, what's bad about being bored? Why don't you want me to be bored? And then it can go deep quite quickly. It could be like, you know what, you were bored your whole childhood. Like no one ever paid attention to you. When this person pays attention to you, it just lights up your whole circuit board. You come alive with that. We like that. We want you to feel alive. Oh, okay. So it's sort of like your positive intention for me is you want me to feel alive. I do.
I want you to feel alive. It's not that I want you to act out and have an affair. It's that part of you that's reaching for that or texting is saying, I want you to feel alive in this world. And there's this vivacious energy that's coming out. And if we don't stop to think about it, we're just acting on it. And yet, if we get in tune to that part that wants us to feel alive, there's a whole nother relationship to that part.
Absolutely. And then it doesn't mean we ignore the one who's has commitments and responsibilities, but instead of just shaming ourselves for this part or just disconnecting so much that we're almost in an dissociated state, doing things that we might regret later, we start to make room for both. And it almost is like internal couples therapy, a little bit like going back and forth with the parts. So if I could add a layer here, we might find that, if we ask both sides of that, okay, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't have me do these things? It often will lead both sides to point towards some sort of inner wound. And oddly enough, it's often the same one. Maybe there's a child in there, a young child part, who is still in there, still holding a lot of the kind of feeling state that they had maybe as a neglected child in a relationship where parents were not paying any attention to the inner life of the child. So maybe there's some core wound in there, and these what we call protector parts have different strategies. You're going to feel alive by not losing your partner. That's how the inner child gets taken care of. This one, well, the inner child gets taken care of when we get someone who's nuts about us and can really thrill us sexually. And I'm like, well, wait a second. What if we could help that child? And there actually is a way to pay attention to the one who's kind of in that deeper, more wounded state and to actually bring it out of there. And it sounds kind of almost miraculous. It kind of is like this is the magic of it, that there are some ways in this inner life with imagery, et cetera, to really bring those parts out of the shadows and help them reintegrate. And in those cases, then the protectors can soften. They don't have to work as hard. We tend to feel more choice, more of that authentic self available, more able to slow down and make the choices that we want to make.
Rather than I think what I hear you saying is also by getting in touch with that, our protector side's not leading the show because our protector needed to be there often when we were younger and maybe we didn't get seen. But if we don't tune into that, then it is our defensive side, our protective side that ends up kind of running our decisions rather than our more integrated side that can slow down and go, of course you want to feel seen and you want to feel this invigoration in you. And let's get in touch with this other part of you that didn't get seen. And now we're really working on integrating the two selves rather than having one kind of dominate mostly on an unconscious level, I think.
Yes, definitely. And it's relieving often because even besides like all the implications in the world, we feel like we're crazy. Like, I mean, I experience this. I'm not just talking about them, out there like me here. I have plenty of my own conflicts and moments where I have been like, why am I doing this? Like, this makes no sense.
I've never done that.
You've never done that?
Never. I've always known, I so relate to that on every level.
Right. So even if it's just that vantage point that like, okay, there's always an emotional logic to what's happening, even if we can't see it at the time.
In your model that you describe it as self-led sexuality. Why self-led?
So that is language that I have incorporated that's based in IFS as Dick Schwartz developed it, because the ideal is for self to lead the system. So instead of any one part running the show, there's access to this like if you do yoga, or if you have just something you do where you start to just feel like you're really in flow, you're in a flow state, you're not triggered, you're not reactive, you're present, you feel, he developed these 8C words to recognize this quality called self. So if you're feeling calm, curious, compassionate, connected, creative, courage, confidence, clarity. I don't know. I always sort of miss one of them along the way. There's 8 of them. But those are some clues that we're sitting in this place that is more expansive, and that's the leading, like that we're leading from there. So
It's
our
like
part,
leading from a more integrated self. I think for those longtime listeners, that's kind of what Sue and I talk about, and being our more secure related place or a more green place. If we can have an openness or curiosity and we're not in an activated space, then we're in our whole self.
exactly.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that would be a good translation. One thing is sometimes people feel like healing means we lose the parts. So sometimes people might use the word integration, like the ideal is to lose the parts and just melt like a melting pot into one. And in the IFS perspective, we don't ever lose our parts, and we wouldn't want to, but we help the parts to heal so they're in a healthy state. And we're like a community, so the parts become the consultants and the constituents in a way, with self leading.
I see. So if we were to use maybe an example of someone, maybe a couple coming to you or an individual, and maybe part of what they're dealing with is a lack of a desire for sexuality, maybe, or some kind of a shutdown in the process of having desire, but when sexuality is around, the freezing happens. How would you integrate this sort of self-led part to try to help an individual get to know those multiple parts of themselves in maybe that example?
Yeah. Well, it would be very much like the earlier example, because we use the word unblending. We find, and kind of as we find the parts that are there, starting with the activated state, as that relaxes, the self just naturally emerges. Dick Schwartz calls it a model of subtraction. So we're trying to sort of subtract the things that get in the way and have a little more space. And then this sort of natural intuition or just knowingness starts to flow. And it's pretty cool, because my own experiments with IFS, when I was learning it, I have some very strong thinking parts and what we call manager parts that really want to learn things and think about them and work hard and, all of that stuff. And when those parts could relax a little bit, I was able to find some of my different younger parts that had developed around that. And I don't know, there was just sort of a more organic way, like even just as a therapist working with my clients, and I wasn't trying so hard and feeling so responsible to fix their problems. If that couple you mentioned came in and I'm like, oh no, and I would have that like, oh no, like I'm the one between them and like divorce and their children having to live in, different homes. And, like I just felt so much responsibility and felt like I had to fix it and I had to know everything. And so that actually cramped me a bit. And so a lot of this work, actually, if anyone's listening who's on the therapist side of the room, is really just helping us relax a bit and have some self energy to be self-led as a therapist. Because then when those parts could soften and relax, I'm like, okay, we're actually not responsible for that. And yeah, we do know a lot of things, but maybe we don't have to like throw them all in the first session. Like I can just sit now and just be curious and just help people notice what's coming up for them right now. And my self energy can lead me, and that invites them to maybe be present to what's emerging in the moment and find some natural flow and leadership, like in the therapeutic process, as well as then helping them get into the sexual challenges they may have.
Which is so important, how we mentioned earlier, for therapists out there listening, knowing your own relationship to sexuality, if we kind of lean into the IFS and sexuality at this point, us knowing how our relationships to sexuality developed, how we feel when the topic comes up. Are we bringing it up? Are we avoiding it? What are our own parts that are disconnected from sexuality or maybe overly connected or whatever it is that's going on for us internally? If we're not having our own awareness of that, then it's going to be really hard to have the space for self led leading of the clients to do self exploration.
Absolutely. And that is one of my big passions. And that is part of the motivation I had to first, I was learning in my own office how to bring IFS to the sexual challenges my clients were bringing. Then I got more curious about my own sexuality. And I was like, gosh, what do I know about my own parts? I felt like my awareness of my own system, which I was very, as I was learning IFS, I was learning about my parts and, oh, this part comes up when I'm with my family. And, these parts come up when I'm in a professional setting. And I realized when I got to my bedroom door, it's like, oop, no parts.
It doesn't exist.
Like I just wasn't even knowing to get curious and pay attention there. And so that was very interesting to say, gosh, where are my parts? Where is self energy? Like what's biological, just, response, and what is my parts showing up here? And what are they allowing me to feel or shutting down? Or, how can they be a resource for me? Something I'll often talk about is my own menopausal transition and how, whereas I had a pretty easy relationship with my sexuality for the most part, not perfect, but became more complicated in that hormonal shift or reduction. And so it really called for me to bring in some new awareness and to listen really closely to my own body. And I found like, oh, I can really listen to the parts that are here. They have information for me. And so it was quite revelatory, honestly, to bring this to my own life and in my own sexual self-awareness and my relationship, my marriage. And then that prompted me to want to bring it into some theory and like what, and create a lot of these concepts that I've come up with. And then that expanded my desire to help therapists to get to know their own parts. Like I was already interested in that, but I think the more I was really living it and just thinking of my own, all the therapists I had, I really don't think really any of them offered an opportunity to have that level of depth in sharing about my own sexuality. And even the sex therapy training, it wasn't quite with that level of, I don't know what to say, just that really personal meaning, like the self exploration. It felt like a little more like this is what you're supposed to believe and think, and not so welcoming of the parts of us that hold maybe some different kinds of views about different things. And just, I loved the training. It was great. I'm still learning. The field has evolved a lot too. But I just felt like this lens offered some really personal way to feel into my parts and my experience. And I thought, I want to help therapists, including sex therapists, IFS therapists, general therapists, to get to know their own parts in this way so they could better hold space for their clients. And also so they could reap the benefits because, our sexuality is a resource. We do hard work. People burn out. We get depleted, right? And so one important thing I think for all people is when we can have some positive relationship with our sexuality is it can really restore us and be a reset button in a relationship. There's a lot of rewards. I want therapists to get the rewards and also to be able to hold that space for their clients.
Yeah, and sexuality, and you've talked about that, sexuality is more than the act of having an orgasm. Even expanding the conversation around sexuality being our life energy, it's what makes us feel vivacious. Like it's not just about an orgasm. And expanding the self led part around what feels sexual to you, what feels sexual to your partner, that is an enlivening conversation, I think.
Absolutely. And one of the first things I do with people in a first conversation, even, or in a first appointment, is what does this word even mean to you? Because when people say the word sex, we're having sex, we're not having sex, I want more sex, I want different sexes. Well, what does that even mean to you? And for some people, it is about intercourse and penetration. And for other people, it's a much broader thing, but it's still in the realm of erotic stimulation. And I do adopt a very expansive notion of this life force energy and how we embody it and how we can allow different levels of pleasure in different contexts and at different times. And then one of the things I've based my model on is just like the 8 C words that Dick Schwartz came up with for self energy was I came to the notion that self energy also has sexual qualities and this core self. And I call these the 6 S's of sexual self energy.
Well, let's walk them through.
Do you want to hear them?
Yeah, well, let's walk them through, and maybe even like, would it be helpful to keep using this couple that come in that I mentioned around sexuality differences, and maybe
Sure.
one part of the
Yeah.
couple is, feeling a block to their sexual energy, and the other part is feeling disappointment because they want more sexuality. It's a very common dynamic in couples. Maybe you could use your modeling kind of, because
Yeah.
then we're covering
Sure.
kind of both aspects.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you the 6
Okay.
S words
Let's do
and
it.
then some of the ways I use them with clients. So the idea is that when our system can allow, when our parts can relax, that this core energy we have has qualities of being safe, sensual, spacious, sensitive, steamy, and satisfied.
Say them again.
Safe, sensual, spacious, sensitive, steamy, and satisfied. Then, while those are qualities that our core self has, of course, we have lots of parts that don't, have that experience. So I'm not saying it's easy necessarily.
Or don't allow it, right?
Or don't allow it. But the idea that we actually, regardless of what anatomy we have or what our body functions are doing in the moment, that these are qualities available to us. It's a very open invitation to embody those qualities. But safe is so important, right? So when people are coming in to talk about that, this couple comes in to talk about it, I'm going to start with, how safe do you feel having this conversation right now? What are you noticing in and around your body as we even anticipate a conversation about this difficult challenge in your relationship? So the safety might be about talking about sex at all, even using the word. And it also might be about a hot spot.
Right. That's been
a hot
there.
potato in the relationship
Right.
that threatens their sense of security with each other. If we can't work this out, are we going to make it? Right. So the attachment needs can feel very threatened when there's this kind of an issue.
Right. So you start with the safety in the room and start with
Yeah. And so there's a lot of different elements of that. And people might have a lot of stories. There may have been betrayals. There may have been injuries in the relationship of varying degrees. And so we'll just say, okay, like how, what do we need to do here? What helps with that? So it might get into just some contracting and things people might do anyway in the beginning of a therapeutic relationship. But also, how do we start to find ways to increase the comfort in the room? And part of it is acknowledging the parts that are there. Yeah, makes sense. This would be scary, and there's a part that doesn't want us to go too fast. And it makes sense that there's a part that doesn't, and the other partner who's afraid we're going to go too slow and you're never going to get your needs met. Like that makes sense.
You can feel the threat in the room for both individuals, right? The partner that is a little afraid to talk about it because it's could create hostility or shame. And maybe the other partner, wait, we need to make it happen. If we go too slow, my needs aren't going to be met. And so that activation in the body, the different parts emerging.
And when we can really validate those parts and recognize them and make a little room for them, almost figuratively imagining we're adding chairs to the circle or something, it often helps people relax, because it's not like when we feel like our needs aren't even being acknowledged, that's often when people, I think, get more triggered. So we can acknowledge these things. So safe can be important in the room. And then when I talk to couples about safety, and safety doesn't only mean physical safety, there are things related to physical safety, but there's also a sense of being able to relax and let down your guard, right? So it might be, are the kids asleep? Do we have a lock on our bedroom door? Like really concrete things. Am I healthy? Has my partner had a few drinks and I just can't really feel safe with them intimately, if they've had a few drinks. So it opens often some really interesting conversation just about the variables in the environment, outer environment, and then turning to the inner environment, like, okay, like all that's okay, but, it's just so hard for me to relax. I have work on my mind. I just can't stop thinking about the kids and carpool or work. What would we need to do to help that part of you feel like it had a little safety to step back?
I could already imagine that the individual who is feeling that their needs aren't getting met sexually, that conversation would be harder for them because they're like, come on, let's get safe so we can move to the next step, right? Like, do you
Right.
like that pressure to kind of come in like, okay, I'll make it safe so we can move on. I guess what I'm meaning is just like thinking about the different activations also in the therapy room that are going to come up about safety. Will the therapist see this as important, or are they going to stay in this building safety way too long and I'm never going to get my needs met? Do you find that comes up?
Honestly, I find something a little different than that more often.
Okay.
I find that they're relieved that we're having this conversation. It's a direct conversation. We're naming what's true and what they're living. And it's something that is so often not able to be discussed. They may feel it more when they're out in their life and those things are going on. And there's always a reason, that they can't connect. But I actually find it's often very relieving for both parties.
Because you're
And it's
having the
also,
conversations in the room.
you're having the
Yeah. Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
in that dynamic you named, often the burden feels like it's on the person who doesn't have the desire or doesn't want to have as much sex. So, but when the person who seems to want sex more gets to talk about safety too, it opens more vulnerability that can soften the other person. I don't feel safe letting you know that I have a strong attraction to you, because I don't feel safe letting you know how I actually feel toward you, because you will get angry or feel like I'm pressuring you. And so when we can get into the fears and the things that get in the way of feeling safe for the person who maybe has been like cast as, I don't know, somehow like a pressure, someone putting pressure on or something like that, it can really equalize the relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. And so after, as we do the six, let's walk us through all six.
Walk
So we
us
go
through.
from six. Yeah,
Okay.
we won't be able
Yeah.
to go through each of them too much in depth, but I know everybody's interested in all six and how you
Yeah. Yeah.
integrating them with this couple. I think that's helpful.
Yeah. And I do find they flow well in order. They don't, always have to, but they seem to work nicely in order. So once there's a certain sense of safety, then we might talk more about sensuality. And that gets into a lot of things too. Like, at the base, it's like, well, when we're actually relaxed and we can be in our own energy, it actually feels good. Like it feels good to relax and feel our own aliveness. And when it's kind of like, mindfulness, like if we're actually present, we can notice sensory pleasures. Like we can notice that something feels good on our arms, or how nice it feels to, touch someone's hair or for them to touch our hair. But if we're anxious and we're disconnected, we're not even present to the sensuality. So it actually helps people become more embodied, and they can have interesting conversations with each other about the things that feel good for them, that don't. It can bring in a lot of cultural legacy messages that it's not okay to feel good, strict backgrounds that said it's sinful, pleasures of the flesh, even things like sensory pleasures, they're a luxury, they're decadent. So like we might run into belief structures around sensuality.
So
And
that would
then,
be really highlighting the different parts that we'd get in touch with, or some of the different narratives and stories that we've stored in our body around sexuality and pleasure, or even just being able to tune into sensuality in our own experience. If that has been too activating, if we're maybe parts of us have learned to tune outside of our body, to caretake, tuning in to our own sensuality, that in of itself could be a challenge and also just a window of opportunity, I imagine.
mhm. And there's tremendous burdens that people socialized as men in Western culture carry around this because they can be, have often experienced severe abuse from peers for being too sensual. I can't tell you how many men I've talked with, that have a story that maybe they were a little too expressive with their gestures when they were in fourth grade and people started to use slurs toward them and shame them and brings in homophobia and all of that stuff and how that just gets squished, so the how people even move through the world might have to be squished.
Oh, and I imagine also just thinking about when we're talking about the cultural messages, those individuals, they're trans or homosexual or bisexual, like all of these aspects that don't fit into the norm of the culture that have been split off. And I think about the split off selves, that who I'm attracted to, how I feel in my body, what gender I relate to has been squished or has been culturally dampened, and bringing that alive through sensuality discussions and opening the conversation for what does feel sensual to you. Maybe that man does want to wear soft things and be more flamboyant, and that's been forbidden in a way in their own body.
It has, yes. And so in the process, there's some real intimacy developing between this couple often because they're having conversations they never had before. I didn't know how you felt when I used a pink blanket and you couldn't use the pink blanket, like whatever. It's just like it can open it. Often people have gotten very locked into a certain dialogue around this stuff, and it just starts to open up new conversations. And then it starts to bring in ways to share some pleasure that maybe don't have all the baggage. There's lots more with all of these. So
Yes.
I know
Well,
we
I
could
know we're
probably
just
talk for days and days about it.
probably
But
just have to trim the surface here. We'll go from for safety and sensuality to the next.
okay. So spacious would be, it's just so interesting. We ask people, how spacious are you feeling as we're talking about this right now? What do you, again, we could go to the body to find that out. It might be when you think about your sex life, how spacious does it feel? And often people are like, it lives in a shoebox, or smaller. There's so many rules. There's so few conditions under which I feel like I have permission to open up to my sexuality.
So helping people explore or maybe recognize the thin layer, and that they have the opportunity to have more spaciousness in their own desires and ways of thinking about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So you,
Right. So, that there's all different things that might come up around that. We really can't look at someone else's sex life and say, that's spacious or that's restrictive. And I used to feel like I could do that. I could say, oh, you only have sex this often, or you only use this one position and it's always the same and it lasts for 2 minutes. But that's all subjective. Like, how does that feel for the people that's their sex life? Like, are they feeling happy? Are they feeling satisfied? Is it what they want? Like, that might feel super spacious, and I have to not project my own preferences onto that.
that's so
Right.
important. Again, bringing the therapist into the room. Like, what concepts do we come into about what is a fulfilling sex life might have very little to do with what the two people or the individual in front of you experience. So you're tuning into what their experience of spaciousness is and helping them explore it and expand if necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Exactly. Yeah. And then we move on to sensitive, which again, as a quality of self energy, would be kind of like attunement, like when we're in that centered place, and the layers, it's almost like a flower that is opening, right? You're feeling safe, you're feeling sensual, you're feeling spacious. Now you've opened to a deeper level of sensitivity. So that's where you might experience more emotional intimacy with yourself or another, or your touch may start to feel more electrifying, or what like it's sort of like everything's opening, and there's just more attunement, more perceptiveness, maybe a little more charge. And so once a couple, say I'm this same couple, we've explored all these things, and then they get to explore together. What happens when they get more open like that, or at what point can they kind of read each other? And often they're not. Like often people are not reading the cues very well, and it also can bring in like highly sensitive persons. Like sometimes sensitivity is like too much for someone, and they feel overwhelmed by sensations. So we have to work with that. Like there's just, these are all sort of like prompts, and they're like, they can open up in a lot of different ways based on the person or the couple or throuple or whoever it is that I'm working with.
And how do you help them explore that sensitivity part? Because can also imagine, depending on the different parts in the room, that could be, an activating conversation. I'm thinking about, maybe I think I want sexuality and intimacy, but when I actually am starting to get more intimate with my partner and the partner's coming more in the room, we could feel our own fear of that kind of connection or vulnerability happening in our body. And now touch becomes too much. I imagine there's so
Absolutely.
much ebb and flow in that.
Right.
How do you help people explore that
Yeah. If they
in the
could
room?
notice that, I'm like, that is so attuned. Like you're really attuning to your own system. So you're showing a lot of sensitivity to your own parts. So if you're noticing that, maybe you can pause a minute and really listen to your parts and see what they're afraid of. Are they noticing you there with them? Are they oriented to this moment, this partner, or are they like off somewhere else, remembering something else? So it could be a prompt for a little bit of inner work, and it could be a chance to speak for your parts with your partner.
And that's so invigorating, I find, in couples work, is when we're getting to know each other in the room on a much deeper, more intimate
More vulnerable.
level.
It's much more vulnerable to share
Right.
that. So steamy is the next S. And that speaks to, again, maybe flow state, when we're really open and we're sort of fully in what we're doing. And I like to tell people these aren't limited to sexuality. Like these are ways we may feel when we're passionate about lots of things in life, but you almost lose everything else, right? When you're really in it, you're not thinking about it anymore. And it might feel really good. It might feel lovely. So steamy is this quality of self energy, but then it can also be maybe correspond with a more aroused state or a more immersive state. And so I like to help couples talk about when they're really turned on. Like, what are your turn ons? What are your turn ons in life? And what are your turn ons in the bedroom? And what's needed there? More or less, more communication about that. So there's different ways to explore that. And
Before you jump into the last one, the one thought I have about that is that there's often, there's individuals that can really get in touch with their steaminess pretty easily. The idea of having sensuality and activation is so right there. And there's other people that are just much more responsive. They need to have it generated. And I feel like our culture is so focused on sexuality, it exists, you're going to feel steamy. And so I like where you're going here, because it's promoting what makes you feel steamy. And it's not always just something that arises. Something can be created. It's a state we can get ourselves into. We can start thinking about what creates steaminess, rather than shaming ourselves if we don't feel, or seeing something as wrong with the interaction if we're not feeling steamy, or if it's steamy is just not a natural state.
yes, for sure. And actually, I've had a lot of asexual people go through my programs, and many have commented that they just appreciate this broadening of the notion of life turn ons. And that it's about what brings us alive. And, when our system can allow it, and, what are the things that we can get big in, kind of.
Might be a really great intimate conversation makes you feel steamy, and that may not give you an orgasm, but it makes you feel vivacious and alive. And
Hmm.
yeah,
And it can involve, sometimes I think actually couples where there's not much desire, sometimes the issue is there's not a lot of aliveness in one or both of the people. And so sometimes when people can embrace their passions, maybe it's for a hobby, and maybe it's dancing, or maybe it's taking hikes together, or maybe they have separate things, that when they can bring their own aliveness through, there's often more to bounce off of in terms of their energetic and sexual relationship. And then the last one is satisfied. And the idea here is that our core self energy is already whole and complete, and it doesn't need anything to be satisfied. It's kind of the self has some, it's not required to use spiritual language, but some people resonate with self having kind of a spiritual element to it. So, this idea of, there's this light, this energy in us, it's already whole and complete. And so, whether I bring my partner to orgasm or not doesn't make me a better or a worse person. Like, I might have my fantasies realized, or I might be kind of disappointed with how things went. And I have a right to feel that way, but it's not dampening my own wholeness and my own aliveness.
so you're centering being satisfied as more an internal experience that you tune into.
Right. It's a both and, I would say. So, this is one that is often tremendously relieving to people who feel a lot of performance pressure. And for a lot of people, sex is a existential battle every time they go into the bedroom, because they are going to pass, and they're going to please their partner, and they're going to feel good about themselves, or they are going to fail, and they're going to feel like a piece of crap, and they're going to feel like they disappointed their partner, and they disappoint everyone, and their exile that feels shameful, not good enough, is going to flood them. You know what I mean? And then whatever, then they're off to the, maybe they're going to disconnect or whatever it is. And the idea that, this isn't, you're already good. Like, you're good.
This is not a reflection. Yes.
Right? Like, you're
Yes.
whole, you're complete. Like, your partner is whole and complete. And maybe you can have fun together, and maybe your body will get aroused, and maybe you'll be a little less aroused. And you might have some frustration. I'm not minimizing sexual frustration. I'm not saying that's not real. So I don't want to say it's an either or. But when we can kind of hold that as, yeah, that was kind of disappointing. I wish I could have done that better, or I wish whatever, but I'm still here. I wasn't annihilated. A lot of times, maybe one person has a partner has erectile dysfunction, or can't orgasm, or whatever it is. And they feel like that's the problem in their sexual relationship, when often the actual problem is the shame they feel about that, and how much they disconnect as a result.
And how much of their own self gets hidden in the relationship to themselves and to their partner, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine. Yeah.
Right, right. And so their partner's frustrated, not because maybe they have some level of, sexual frustration, but really the bigger frustration is often the attachment injury there. Like, you left me, like, you
You go
went
inside
somewhere.
yourself so much with
Right.
the
With the
fear.
shame.
Yes. Mhm.
So that the satisfied one really, I think, is often very powerful for people. It can take a lot of pressure off.
I imagine. I imagine it can really, really release when you're saying you're satisfied. And why did you use the word satisfy? I love the direction you went in then. The word satisfied is so much associated with satisfying your partner or feeling satisfied, right? But you're making it much more organic, the concept of being satisfied.
Right. It just felt right to me that there's like, that there's not an agenda. And that's something that Dick Schwartz talks about when we're recognizing self energy, is it's a state, and it doesn't have a drive or an agenda behind it. It doesn't need things to be different than they are.
Got it. It
And
just
so
is.
that's the same state we're talking about here. So if we're bringing that into the bedroom, what if we can just be there without needing things to be different than they are, and without needing to escape the moment we're in because we have some idea that there's a different way that things are supposed to be?
Which is so vital to the whole conversation about sensuality and sexuality, isn't it? Because how often to be able to stay present with ourselves, to be able to stay present with our partner or partners, it really means the idea of being present. And when we are in our own distracted selves, our own sense of dissatisfaction because we didn't perform or we didn't, something that we thought was going to happen didn't happen, it takes us completely out of being present with ourselves and with one another. So the work you're doing is just really bringing people in the room with all of their parts. And you mentioned the exiled parts. And for those that aren't familiar with the language, can you describe what you mean? We've been talking about it all along, but can you describe what you mean and how it comes up often in sexuality?
Right. So to use maybe the example of someone who's feeling a lot of performance pressure, they, if they were to, if I could help them kind of drop through the layers inside, they may find their way to, and it might be through imagery, it might be in a body sensation, but just the feeling of having been a child who had to be perfect maybe to get any attention from their parent. The exile, it's sort of like a part of ourselves, often a young part. It doesn't have to be. We can acquire exiles as we get older too, but typically they're pretty young, that had some sort of really overwhelming, not good experience. And they're almost frozen in it in time. And they're like in a little bubble inside of us. It's kind of like it just got shunted off into the basement, or like kind of sealed off in a little bubble somewhere, so that it stays out of our awareness, but it isn't healed. It's still carrying the emotions and the body sensations of that overwhelming moment. And sometimes it's one really clear, overwhelming moment. And I'm realizing that's not the best language either, because sometimes it's just been like a chain of kind of subtle exclusions or something like that, but there's like a state, there's a familiarity with like, oh, I know that feeling. I'm not being seen or something like that. And so we don't want to feel those things day to day. And so we often try to live our lives in ways where we don't activate those feelings, but certain situations will.
And I imagine with sexuality, there's a lot of situations, whether it's maybe shutting down our own sense of arousal for the feelings of vulnerability it might bring, or our own sense of desire for the feelings of shame it could bring. Are those examples?
Yeah. And honestly, it can go the other way as well. Sometimes people have been overstimulated when they were young, or maybe they self soothed. Maybe they had a household where there was a lot of anxiety and they figured out how to soothe themselves with playing with their genitals as a way to fall asleep and feel comfortable. For them, like, why do I have such an urgent need to have sex? Like the partner might feel really overwhelmed with a partner, who's just seems very demanding sexually and very needy. But then their exile might be one that felt really alone and only felt soothed with sexual stimulation. And so when they can find that one and heal it and start to bring to it the kind of acknowledgement it never got, it often can sort of be released from that one intensive way of trying to take care of itself.
And not doing it without no longer is it, if like let's say we went with the example of the pressured for sexuality with that kind of a history, I could also imagine the shame involved in having that desire and the pressure, like maybe they've heard from partners, you're too sexual focused. I can imagine the negative narratives that they've grown into about them being too much or sex being too forward. And somehow they're, I think our culture very much shames us, it shames men especially for that kind of pressure. And what I hear you doing is offering this idea of getting to know that part that feels the pressure and welcoming that in the room, not to rule the show, but to get to know that part and what it was about, and to care with deep compassion and care, so that the exiled part is not the one ruling the sexuality between the partnerships.
Right. And, there are ways beyond what I probably, have time to explain today where we really specifically go to that part and like help it leave the scene and help it have a do over of what it needed at the time and to release certain things and bring it into connection with self energy, which becomes kind of the parent in a way to the part. It's sort of like an interconnection happens that is reparative. It's an internal attachment model.
So maybe in that example, very briefly, I know we have to wrap, but very briefly, what would that look like maybe in that example? What would your goal be? Well, I don't know goal, but what would be your process, do you think, to get to that?
People, depending on their history, some pretty big stuff can happen in just a few sessions. For other people, it'd be, more ongoing work to continue to heal and explore this stuff. But what could happen is that then the pressure is alleviated. So the person may still have a strong desire for sex, but it isn't with this desperation. And it isn't like if my partner says no, I'm completely abandoned. Like the emotional meaning is different. It doesn't land as vulnerably. There's more room for choice. The person's ears are back on their head and they can maybe hear what the other person is saying without, having this whole internal belief system around it where maybe they can't even hear.
Right. Which is immediately bringing me back to the first S, which is meaning that you're increasing safety in the room, in the circular nature, because now instead of this pressure being there and I need to be satisfied, we have a whole nother element in the room that can bring care and compassion and connection to that exact same experience, rather than a lack of safety from the pressure. Like, oh, I get it. That doesn't mean I go satisfy it as a partner if it's coming from that place, but I can sit with it and I can be with that pressure in the partner. You have a concept of internal consent. Can you briefly describe that? And then I know we're going to have to wrap, but
Yeah,
talk to us
yeah.
about internal consent because it feels
Yeah,
related. Yeah.
it does. Yes. So often consent education or consent conversation is based on the idea of interpersonal, like two or more people having a conversation. Would you do this? Or are you okay to do that? And honestly, we're lucky if people get that far because it's not an easy conversation to have. There's a lot of difficulties in really putting into play the things that we might be wanting to agree to or not agree to. But internal consent came to me as kind of like that question at the beginning, like, why am I doing this thing? And then I feel bad about it, and I might even be initiating sexual activities with my partner, but then I don't even want to be doing it. There's a million scenarios. And so when I was listening to my clients, I was like, well, wait a second, there might have been consent this way, like between you and your partner, but I'm not sure there was consent amongst your parts before you initiated that. And so internal consent is a process for helping people to pause, to slow down, to listen inside when there is some kind of an opportunity or an experience that could bring in more vulnerability for yourself or for someone else, and to really feel into it. Tuning in, if you already know that you have parts and you can discern those, you might be having a little roundtable discussion with your parts. It might be a pause to just feel into your somatic experience. I'm saying yes, but my body is kind of tensing up. Is there congruence here? So there's different ways to explore it, but the idea is that you're pausing and really deeply feeling into the inner consent as the basis for then, like, and actually it's relevant to solo sexuality too. Some people will feel like they're doing things, self-pleasure, masturbation, watching porn, maybe calling an ex, or different things that people might do that actually internal consent is really important for their activity. And it also is important with others, with partners.
I think it sounds like it's giving an opening to all the different aspects of ourselves and giving it some room to have a voice right? Whether it's, do I want to consent or am I consenting for different parts of me that can't say no? What part of me wants to say yes, but what part of me doesn't? And can the part of me doesn't have room instead of to be heard and then asked to open up? But we're talking about our internal opening rather than somebody else's expectation. And it's hard, I think, for all of us. I think definitely for women, but I think all of us to be able to like really tune in and go, wait a minute, what is our own consent, our own desire? How do we find that instead of being pleasing or reacting out of fear? Getting to another one of your words, it seems like we're hitting spaciousness, right? As we X for internal consent, we're being more spacious.
Mm-hmm. And then it really calls for self energy to be able to implement that because it takes courage, it takes confidence, it takes connection, it sometimes takes creativity to do that. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell someone no or to negotiate, and if I go back to my menopause example, and even in a very secure long-term marriage, it was really hard to say, this thing that we've done for so long that worked well and isn't working for me anymore. And it felt really scary to say that and like think something has to be different. And parts that would just go along because they just didn't want to have that conversation. And speaking the results of the internal consent committee can take courage. And that's a whole nother set of parts.
Oh, yeah. I can really relate to that and relate to things that before felt like just who you were sexually starts to shift. But if you only relate to that part of yourself sexually, you think your sexuality has gone away rather than wait, there's different parts that, as we go through different stages in our lives, like menopause or after having a baby or, that we have to get to know our own bodies in a different way and then give ourselves voice to that. Wait, my body's different. And it's so hard sometimes in a relationship because like it's so easy for it to be felt as, something's wrong or
Criticism or rejection, or we're going to lose our connection, or there's lots that can come up. And so I always want to just honor the complexity of this realm. I mean, just being human is complex. And then really shining a light on these aspects of life can be complex because we're talking about our biology and our psychology and our social relationships and our religion, and like a lot of things converge in this very intimate space. If anyone's listening and feeling overwhelmed, I don't want people to feel overwhelmed, but I want to validate feeling overwhelmed too, because there's a lot in this. And at the same time, there's the simplicity when we know that we all have self energy. It can't be created or destroyed, no matter how much trauma someone's had. And if we have the patience and persistence to help our parts feel known and to open space, that self energy can guide us in natural and organic ways into those 6S experiences.
it keeps us away from the concept of being damaged or damaged. Like those different parts of ourselves are there for good reasons and healthy reasons. And you're giving voice to it and allowing it to move and allowing the exiled parts to come in. And it's a welcoming approach, a very welcoming to all parts of self approach.
It is. And one more thing I'd like to
Yeah, I
mention
was going to ask
is,
you, what's one thing we haven't covered that you wanted?
well, capitalism.
Oh my God, please speak to me.
In 30 seconds about capitalism, because there are a lot of people making a lot of money off of helping us feel insecure and damaged. Because if you watch, whether it's your social media feed or TV or whatever it is, you will see sex portrayed, by people with these gleaming muscled bodies and these notions that sex belongs to the beautiful, young, able-bodied, primarily white people, and it's spontaneous arousal and it's steamy all the time. And if you're not feeling that, you should try this pharmaceutical and you should go to this gym and you should get this surgery and take this supplement, like it's just a known thing, right? Like creating a market for these things. And so it's, I don't want to put it all on the individual. If you're feeling insecure or not good enough in bed or as a sexual being, there's a pretty much barrage coming at us all the time, kind of sending a message that we aren't good enough and we don't have the right stuff.
And we can help you. Buy this one product and you will now be steamy in bed. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of comparing on social media, well, gosh, that person looks like they have the life, they really have the life and I don't. And that can make us feel depressed. And then we don't feel sexy either. Like there's just, and I'm not even bringing in then all the isms that people who have more marginalized identities encounter every time, they leave their house, right? So if you're being othered or you're being looked at, with eyes of disrespect or sexualization or all those things impact us.
And they impact the different parts of us, right? I love that because we're not just talking about parts that are from our family of origin. We're talking about the entire system that impacts us culturally and how we feel about ourselves when we walk out the door.
So, in doing these groups, I call them bliss groups, behold and lead your internal sexual system. It's an acronym. So, when I run these bliss groups and bliss trainings and help people go through these S's, there's a lot of power in doing it as a group because, it brings it out into the open. There's part of the damage is the isolation and the internalization of all these negative beliefs. But I've learned that this approach is quite radical and it's quite revolutionary because it's countercultural. So the culture is saying sex is this. And this approach is saying, no, like it's something that we all have access to and it can take a lot of different forms. And I'm not saying the only one saying this or IFS is the only way, but there's a lot of different approaches that are really looking from the inside out and not pushing back on what we get told.
And how important it is to do that and how validating it is to hear and to have you on the show talking about this, because I think it is an element that can be so freeing. If somebody's interested in a bliss group, tell me that. So bliss stands for, remind everybody.
Behold and lead your internal sexual system. So those are bliss groups. And I need to kind of scale because at this point they have been kind of nurtured as smaller groups for therapists to be in who already have some IFS training or background. But I'm working on creating more tools and resources for people to be able to access this curriculum without those qualities. On my podcast.
I was just about saying, you have a podcast. So before we jump, tell everybody about your podcast.
Yes,
it's so exciting.
Yes.
I heard you your interview with Richard on there.
It's coming up on my 1-year anniversary. So it's still a baby compared to Therapist Uncensored. But it is called Self-Led in Bed, an IFS and Sexuality podcast. So we're exploring all different aspects of the internal sexual system, as I call it, and bringing in different experts in different areas and also people who have just been on their own journeys using this approach and talking about, just lots of different things. I encourage people to check that out if they're interested in a little more. And I do have a 6 S's visual graphic available as well, which people can find on my website. It's a free download.
And tell us your website.
patriciarich.com.
All right. And all of this that Patricia just mentioned will be in our show notes. So you can find a link to her podcast and her website, more information, including some information about the S's that we talked about. So thank you so much for joining us, Patricia. This is I feel like we could cover so much. It's impossible to cover this kind of conversation in the short length of time that we had, but I feel like you did an amazing job bringing the understanding of both IFS and how to use it with sexuality. It was so valuable.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I loved your curiosity and your questions and just really grateful for this opportunity.
Very fun. All right. Well, thanks, you guys, for joining us today. Please take the time to rate and review us. And if you got as much out of this conversation as I did, pass it on. Send it to somebody that also can gain from this information. Until then, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.